Speaking was actually really transformative for me. That in the very early days as a teacher, I was under the impression that I had to write out all my lectures and then I had to sit there and read them. And as I was reading out my lectures, I would get bored as I was reading them, and so my voice would degenerate into a fairly flat monotone, and I would lose myself in the text and feel very nervous, and it would all start to fly apart on me. Then I saw Donna Haraway talking one day, and Donna was just the absolute opposite of that. She was just like, she was there, present on stage. She was never looking at her notes. And I said, well, how the heck did she do that? So I asked her, and what she does is she structures out a talk beforehand. And she knows there are certain risks that are going to be there. But she doesn't know in precisely what order, she doesn't know precisely how it's going to be developed. She just knows that she's got a set of stories that are going to weave together into a tale, and she tells the tale in real time. So for me, it was like that moment of the cripple throwing away their crutches. It was throwing away the notes, relying when I talk now on just images in PowerPoint. And being able to engage directly with the audience. And that really made all the difference in the world. And I went from being someone who's very nervous about public speaking to someone who actually enjoys it immensely at the moment. So that's as far as the speaking is concerned. As far as the reading, it's sort of difficult to cast my mind all the way back to my undergraduate career. It was the chance to engage with really major works, long works, really monograph-length stuff, where I'd always been a fairly voracious reader. But reading a monograph is a sort of different skill set that I'd never really learnt. Like, in the 70s, early 70s, when I was doing my undergraduate, it was reading folks like Karl Marx, reading Claude Lévi-Strauss, The Savage Mind. And the ability to talk that over with other people, to think through, so that it was not only me thinking about the text, it was thinking through the text with other people. Those two texts were really formative, and that mode of learning and that mode of expressing has become really important for me moving forward. So I'm still in a number of reading groups, both academic and non-academic reading groups, because I just enjoy that experience of working through text together. What's the third part of that? Writing. Yeah, writing's more difficult. I mean, I think the thing for me about writing was learning how to find my own voice. That I was convinced in the early days that what I had to do was, do the academic product the way the academic product is expected to be. And I realized, well, if I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing that, I'm going to hate my career. And so I've always had a trick when I'm writing, which an old history professor gave me, which is that as I'm writing a major monograph, as I'm writing any monograph, I try to read people whose style I really enjoy at the time that I'm writing it. So in the early days, that was John Stuart Mill. His work on liberty, for example, is absolutely superb, clear English prose as you've never read it before. And that really helped me a lot in those early writing experiences. Latterly in my writing, I've tried to really try to be more poetic and more adventurous in my writing. And so I often will be reading someone like Michel Serres, who's my favorite French philosopher, as I'm writing something, just to remind me that there are other ways of being and other ways of expressing myself as I move along. That is always a very difficult question for me. And the simplest answer, although it's going to be the most obscure answer, is I'm interested in time. Everything I do is about the study of time. And so even though in my research career I've worked in departments of communication, schools of science studies, I've worked in library and information science, I'm currently in informatics. So I've been forced into lots of different domain areas. But throughout all the domain areas, it's always about time, one way or another. The way in which that's coming out right now, I've got 3 different areas that I'm working in. One is what's called very broadly scientific cyber infrastructure. That is, how do scientists work together and collaborate together using online tools and using computers. So how do they design databases? How do they talk to each other? How do they collaborate? How do they write together? And particularly on that right now, I'm studying this really ambitious project called EarthCube, which is an attempt to federate knowledge across all of the geological sciences. There are about 20 or 30 of them, so that all of the databases can speak to each other. It's what we call interoperable databases. They can all speak to each other. And lots of the computer scientists believe moving in that that's purely a technical question. All we need to do is get what's called the metadata right. But in fact, knowledge sharing is a lot about people being together, cultures of sharing. Some groups, for example, botanists, are very reluctant to share uncertain results. Other groups demand that you share uncertain results or want the uncertain results from another field. Some people want to provide lots of metadata so that it's easy to translate their data across into other fields. Some people are really reluctant to do so. So it's dealing with the whole, trying to understand the whole culture, cultures of data sharing, cultures of collaboration, especially in very large-scale interdisciplinary domains. That's one area. Second area is standard rule of academia, go where the money is. Right now there's a lot of money in big data. And databases are a fairly have been a central concern of mine. My current book, which I'm finishing up, is on how to read databases, trying to take a humanities perspective to reading what seems like a fairly recondite and difficult set of tools. I mean, databases do not seem. It's not like reading Shakespeare, but I think we need to use the kinds of tools that we use to read Shakespeare to read and understand databases as the important cultural phenomena of our time. So I'm doing a lot of work on big data. Right now we're with some colleagues in New York and Microsoft Research in Cambridge. We're advising the National Science Foundation on the big data projects that they're putting together, in particular issues of social and policy and cultural issues as they get built into very large-scale databases, how that data is mined, what kinds of social effects it has, and how we can advise. And what's really crucial in this is that we don't want to be the social science researchers who come in after the design process. We want to be part of the design process. And so that follows on a strand of research I've had for a number of years on values in the design of information systems and technology, where again we argue that people who are concerned about the design, are concerned about the policy, are concerned about the underlying social issues, need to be trained and be able to be in there at the design stage. That's the second part. Third part is new modes of knowledge production. So what does it mean? And that's a double header. It falls broadly under the rubric, which we're calling somewhat ambitiously the Re-Enlightenment Project. So reimagining the Enlightenment for the 21st century. Why the Enlightenment? Well, the Enlightenment that's the period that gave us the university disciplines as we know them. And literally inscribed in stone as you go around campuses, the Department of History, the Department of English, the Department of Physics, so on and so forth. That form of knowledge, kind of held within individual disciplines, is breaking down, has been breaking down for at least 50, 60 years. Universities are very, very slow to catch up to that. So I'm interested in the administrative side, the political side of how do we change universities and how do we change the valuation and the understanding of research so that we can actually recognize and encourage the kinds of interdisciplinary research that we need in order to answer the basic problems of our time. The second part of that is the more creative part, if you like, and that's that we now have new tools available to us as researchers to express ourselves in whole new ways. When I was a wee lad, it was all about articles and books, and those were the coins of the realm. And in many ways, they still are the coins of the realm. However, we can now express ourselves using a whole range of visual material, sonic material, performances, as well as, the traditional writing will never go away, but we need to see that knowledge can be expressed in other ways and in some ways should be expressed in other ways. The best example I can give for that is going to sound somewhat obscure to many of you, is Levi-Strauss wrote a fabulous series of books called The Mythologies in the 1970s. And The Mythologies basically traces a single myth from a tribe in South America and traces that myth out right throughout the world. The system of myths that it's connected with, and how the myth itself is transformed as it moves across. Now, as I'm describing that, what I'm describing is a fairly topological movement, and Levi-Strauss himself was very into the mathematical discipline of topology. So what he was trying to do was describe a very, very complex structure, but use a linear form in order to describe the complex structure. What we're trying to do right now is remediate a number of projects which were written in linear form but conceived of and thought about in these complex structural forms. What would it mean to represent them in the forms that we think are more native to what the author had in mind? Well, let me start that with a bit of a negative, that I'm not certain that there should be all that much difference between professional and amateur researchers, and a very specific reason for that. There is a move right now in science, it's called crowdsourcing, crowdsourcing science, that scientific work, scientific observations don't just have to be done by the professionals. And there are things like bird watching, or Galaxy Zoo is a very common one. Galaxy Zoo, what you get to do is you get to classify galaxies. It's too much work for individual astronomers to do. You spread it out and make it a bit of a cottage industry. Now, the way in which that works is often fairly exploitative. It's people doing scientific research but not getting paid for it, so it's free labor. And Jonathan Zittrain has this wonderful idea of, well, what's the cognitive division of labor in these sorts of crowdsourcing projects? One of the things I'm interested in about for the University of the Future is how do we create new cognitive divisions of labor so that we can take advantage of right now lost generations of PhD students, many graduate students who have been professionally trained but are not within a professional environment. And so I think looking forward, I would hope that some of the barriers between the ivory tower of the university and the wider community start to break down, and we start to see research as something which can be done with and by the larger community. That said, there is a huge difference between being an amateur researcher without training and being someone with training. The advantage of the training there is when I get into a complex text, it's very, very rare for me, especially as a young researcher, someone starting out on the road, to really be aware of the background of what's being said, what's being argued. That there are all these phrases and all these words that are actually key phrases and key words that might relate to Immanuel Kant or Leibniz or Diderot. And if I were a trained researcher, I would know that. And I would learn that in my seminars. I would learn that in my undergraduate education. So I would have some kind of understanding of this isn't just a one-off thing that I'm reading. It's part of an ongoing discourse. And in a sense, that's what you get at university education, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels, is you get to learn how to be part of the conversation. It's an extended conversation. It goes off in all sorts of different interesting directions. But you need to learn the rules of the conversation in order to be able to carry it out in any reasonable fashion. In many ways, this relates to Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger's notion of communities of practice. They have this wonderful concept they call legitimate peripheral participation, which is kind of an apprenticeship model of education, that you go into a seminar at a university, say, and often you just feel like you're hanging on there with your fingernails. You don't really understand what's being said, or why somebody said something, or why this word suddenly appeared in this book. But you just keep hanging in there with the conversation. You don't necessarily need to be taught it directly, but as you take part peripherally in that academic conversation, you start to learn the rules, you start to learn good moves and bad moves, you start to become professionalized. And as you become professionalized, you can really take part in that conversation, recognizing that the words and phrases and concepts that you're using have resonance. They don't just exist in isolation. So as an individual researcher, you can understand individual ideas. Understanding how they fit together into ongoing, continuing conversations within academia, that's what professionals can do. It's a huge field. So I'm just going to give a couple of favourites that spring to mind, and maybe more will come along as I talk. A book that's hugely influenced me in recent years is This is Enlightenment. It's a book by edited by two Enlightenment scholars, Cliff Siskin and Bill Warner. What's interesting for me about that is that they've taken modern media studies, ways in which we've been able to look at the media in new ways, and use them as a way of reinterpreting the way in which knowledge was produced during the Enlightenment period. So, for example, one of the most famous products of the Enlightenment was the encyclopedia, the French encyclopedia, which was produced by French philosophers such as, Voltaire, who gave us Candide, Diderot, D'Alembert. And you sort of think, well, this came out of their heads. They didn't have information technology at that stage. But with a media studies view of it, they actually go back into the history, and they uncover some really great innovations in information technology that were being made by the people who were writing the encyclopedia, so they could produce random access to bits of information, for example, this kind of random access that is so easy with computers and so unimaginable beforehand. So what that book did was that it really helped me think through knowledge making today, and using our understanding of knowledge making today as a way of understanding knowledge making in the past. Lisa Gittelman's work has been heavily influential for me in that respect as well. There's a book she wrote recently called Paper Knowledge. A second has been Jerry McGann has just written a marginally annoying but very interesting book called The New Republic of Letters. And what's interesting about it is that it traces affiliation of various forms of knowledge making back into the 19th century that I had just been unaware of it and not thought of it. If anyone asks your average Anglo-American what philology is, they think, well, that's dry as dust study of something or other to do with words. What McGann does, and does absolutely beautifully, is show that there's been a strong philological tradition, which he traces in part back to Nietzsche in very interesting ways. There's been a strong philological tradition which has continued from the 19th century, and it's been one which has been highly productive of most of the work that I've actually found interesting in critical theory. Now, I had not been aware. I knew the critical theory stuff. I didn't know that filiation. So knowing that filiation, knowing where and how that work came from, has been really, really important to me. And the other thing that McGann is trying to do is he's trying to rethink the canon, for example. Now, in many ways, university courses are built around, and our knowledge of literature is built around the canon, whatever the canon might be. It's a restricted body of work. Huge advantages to have a restricted body of work. I mean, that's why classical scholarship, for example, is so innovative, is because they've got so few things to read. They've got to innovate with their techniques. So I'm always looking there for good ideas about knowledge production. In brackets there, Leslie Kirk just wrote a fantastic book called Aesop and the Invention of Greek Prose, which talks about Socrates and the philosophers before Socrates had real difficulty with the idea of writing philosophy. Philosophy should be performed. It should be something which is done in dialogue with people in person. So Socrates' Symposia, for example. And so what Kirk has done is produce this fantastic reading of Aesop and Aesop's fables, in order to find an underlying discourse which was actually about writing and about the possibility and need to write philosophy. So I found that absolutely fantastic. So closing that parenthesis, what McGann has done with respect to the canon is saying, well, look, the new tools that we've got, the new ways we've got of understanding literature, it ain't no more about focusing on that single great text, typically by a dead white author, typically by a dead white male author. It's about understanding the cultural moment. And we couldn't understand the cultural moment in the past because we didn't have access to the social networks of the writers that we were studying. We didn't have electronic versions of the papers they were reading. We didn't have electronic versions of the diaries that they and their friends all kept. We can now trace work, and he does this beautifully with respect to Mark Twain. No, sorry, Edgar Allan Poe. Does this beautifully with respect to Edgar Allan Poe. We can now trace and understand Poe's work without having that central laser-like vision on Poe, but trying to understand the creativity in that particular sociocultural moment. So I think that's a great example for me of new techniques enabled by computing, which are enabling us to get a new kinds of understanding of the world and new kinds of understanding of culture. Okay, the value of interdisciplinary research. Again, I'm going to start off being somewhat contrarian here. Let's talk about some words. Disciplinary. I sort of fall into the camp, if someone starts talking about disciplines, I reach for my gun, although I know I shouldn't do that. Disciplines, there are no disciplines. The discipline of sociology, for example. That is certainly not a discipline. It's one of my home areas, but there are fighting camps within sociology. The ethnomethodologists don't believe what the social network analysts do has any value. They don't believe what the symbolic interactionists do have any value. So we have this kind of rubric, this generic rubric, which is about skill sets. And there is something valuable about communities that have skill sets. And I think that's what we should be understanding by discipline. That's not what disciplines are. So we then had this move from disciplinary to interdisciplinary. That was a move that really started, the push really started with Vannevar Bush in 1945 when he wrote this As We May Think, which gave us the idea of the Memex, which was one of the early notional hypertext devices, but also he wrote one of the foundation documents for the National Science Foundation, and the NSF was really built on funding and supporting interdisciplinary research. Now, interdisciplinary research is problematic in the sense of it's everybody brings their own discipline to the table, and then you sort of get a kind of, you sit around the table together, and then everyone takes home their own disciplinary findings. Multidisciplinary research is, transdisciplinary research is, I think, stronger than that, and that's where the real value is. And that's what we need to be doing. It's what new kinds of questions can we ask by really ranging across the disciplines, by really bringing scientists into dialogue with poets, into dialogue with artists, into dialogue with sociologists, into dialogue with historians. And if we can get those people talking together, and develop a language for them to be able to talk together, that's the only way in which we're going to learn to face the major challenges of our time. Like my background is in science and science studies, climate change. We need the artists and the scientists and the humanists. We need them all working together in order to address what's a question that doesn't break itself up into disciplinary chunks at all easily. So for me, interdisciplinary research that's a sine qua non of doing good research, is it has to be interdisciplinary. But I'm speaking as someone who's native interdisciplinarian there, and I know there will be other completely valid responses to that question. Within the Re-Enlightenment group that I'm part of right now, we actually talk about dedisciplinary movement. And the dedisciplinary movement is just getting away from the idea of discipline completely, and concentrating on things like skill sets and people working with skill sets, talking together. But for me, it's about fostering that dialogue, fostering that conversation. If you remember before, I was talking about part of learning how to be at university is learning how to enter into a conversation. What we need to be able to do as interdisciplinary researchers is to foster new kinds of conversation, and that's a skill that we don't have yet within the universities. It's one that's growing, it's there in pockets, but for me it's absolutely the future of universities. That's a great question. For me, online has always had there's always the possibility of acquiring tacit knowledge online as well as face-to-face. There's sort of a mythos about tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is described as that which cannot be made explicit, that which cannot be described. And in a sense, that's sort of silly. I cannot imagine anything that cannot be described in some way or another. The circumlocution might be very, very long, and it might get completely tedious after a while if I were to describe to you all of the tacit knowledge that I used to walk across the room and open the door, which is just next to me. So it would become tedious, but it's doable. But the tacit knowledge itself, it's a community thing. It's something that you learn through participation in communities. If you're, for example, in many communities, because I'm often playing around in communities where I really don't understand the science that they're doing, I don't necessarily understand the math that they're doing, but I've built up expertise, and the expertise has not been about going into the field, it's not been about the practice there, it's been about listening in to their listservs where possible, reading what they write, reading articles about them in Science or in Nature or in New Scientist. It's triangulating across a huge array of sources, a huge array of material. And out of that triangulation work, you start to pick up what are the tricks of the tacit knowledge. There are things that are always going to be difficult. One of the best responses that I've seen, for example, is the Computer Museum the Science Museum in London has this thing about firing up the old computers, the 1960s, 1970s computers. They call them steam up days after the steam locomotives. And what they do is they take videotapes of people as they're using the old computers. And it wasn't just a case of input here, look what happens there. It's input here, bang over there, juggle that over here, jump up and down a bit, and then the computer works. And so preserving those kinds of movements and those kinds of gesture sets, which were integral physically to that computing environment and were part of the tacit knowledge, that I think is quite possible to capture online in interesting ways. So I think we shouldn't be too worried about the myth of tacit knowledge. I think a lot of it is capturable between that move of either directly filming or triangulation. Within science, for example, I'd highly commend folks to a new journal, relatively new journal, called the Journal of Visual Experiments. The old way of doing science and writing science, and what caused lots of problems and why Polanyi came across the idea of tacit knowledge in the first place, is that scientific articles don't describe how to do science. They don't tell you all the tacit stuff. They just tell you the minimum necessary. And it's, from within my field, it's completely well accepted that you cannot replicate an experiment based on what's written in an article. So the Journal of Visual Experiments videotapes people as they're carrying out the experiment. You see the equipment, you see the motions that the lab technicians are making, you see what the scientist is doing, you see what they're writing into the notebook, and then you see what they write about it afterwards. So that new capability, you didn't used to be able to have that kind of knowledge of the tacit work that was being done. Traditionally, what you had to do to share tacit knowledge was to move around. So graduate students would move from lab to lab, and that was the way that tacit knowledge was shared between labs. Now with things like JOVE, the Journal of Visual Experiments, I think it's quite possible to put a lot of that online. First of all, I think it's so important just to continue learning. I mean, it is so horrible, this idea that you go to university and after university you're learning, you've done your learning, now you've just got the rest of your life to take care of. Learning is always an apprenticeship process. Writing is always an apprenticeship process. It takes forever. I'm still learning how to learn. One of the techniques which I've already mentioned a little bit before is reading groups, reading with other people, with their own sets of expertise. For me, that's incredibly important. Having a theme that you're really, really interested in following through. I find almost any book that I pick up incredibly interesting. I just love reading. I absolutely adore it. But I can't afford the time, the energy, even the expense to read every book that I want to read. And I can't afford to read every book, every word in every book. So what I'll do, for a lot of my stuff, I read, for example, because I'm interested in time, I read a lot of philosophy of quantum mechanics. But I don't read that thinking, oh my gosh, I now need to understand Lorentz transformations or string theory. I read it saying, what are they saying that's interesting about time? How are they answering my question? So have your own questions there. And always be, coming back to you, are they answering my questions? Is this really helping me with my life quest and my passion? Work out what your passion is, see if this work is helping along with it, is helping along with that. And then start to snowball. You always, if you find something that's interesting, look at the footnotes. Who are they citing? Start to read who they're citing. Who are they citing? And again, when you're snowballing like that, you don't necessarily look at, just what they've cited. You say, well, this looks like an interesting researcher. What's she been doing lately? So you go to her webpage, you look at the kind of stuff that she's doing. And that's the way you can keep actually really, really abreast of a lot of really interesting work that's going on. You've got a core focus as you're working, and you've got a real sense of achievement and a sense of moving forward as a lifelong learner as you continue. I think the main advice that I'd give is to keep your interest up, to keep your universities should be about, they should be about fostering curiosity, fostering a sense of strangeness, a sense of wonder in the world around you. The world is full of wonder. It's full of spiritual beauty, it's full of physical beauty, it's full of intellectual beauty. You need to learn how to appreciate that beauty, but as you do, it makes an incredibly fulfilling life for you. All of your experiences become richer as you continue your learning experience. Every aspect of your life becomes richer. And so just keep at it. Keep learning, keep reading, keep playing. And understand that education, learning, research, it's about play as much as about work. It's about things that make you happy, things that make the hair stand up in the back of your head, things that give you that tinkle of delight. Oh my gosh, I'd never thought about things that way. I'm constantly surprised in my life that way. If I'd stopped reading, if I'd stopped caring, if I'd stopped learning, the surprise wouldn't be there and the wonder wouldn't be there, and I'd be a much poorer person for it.